This is Brian Jackson with Lot Up. Like and subscribe to our channel to get more legal understanding of the real world. This is for everyone. This just isn't for attorneys. This is to help everyone better understand the law. We've got a great episode today. I'm in my festive gear. We're talking Christmas. We're talking Home Alone. We're talking the legal issues of Home Alone. So this should be a fun podcast, breaking down, going through all the legal issues that we have here with Home Alone here. There's lots of legal issues going on here in the movie, which makes it fun, but also good for an attorney to go through. And like all attorneys do, say, hey, that's not real or that shouldn't happen. So I've gone through and just pinpointed all the legal issues as it relates to Home Alone. This should be a funner episode. My first episodes, I went through and kind of like a lecture series, giving a breakdown, 500-foot view of some of the courses taught in law school, which are still good to review, and you can still get a good understanding of what is taught in law school in less than the amount of time that they teach you in law school. So those are good podcasts to refer to, and I may refer to a few to here as we go through all this. But yeah, let's get started. So first, right off the bat, the beginning of the movie, you have Harry, one of the bad guys. He's dressed as a police officer in the Mcallister home. So right off the bat, there's a legal issue here, and a lot of what I'm looked at too in preparing for this is Illinois law, and just so you know, not all states have the same laws. The laws vary from state to state, so what we talk about here too may not apply to all the states. There's 50 different laws. So just so you know, if we talk about law, it may not be applicable to your specific state. And also, laws change all the time. They can get amended. So it may not be the most up-to-date if you view this podcast a couple years down the road. So we have, again, Harry impersonating a police officer. So under Illinois law, that is a first-degree felony. And what the law is you can't come into the home of someone and falsely represent that you're a unit of government or a contractor or some kind of telephone repair, internet repair. So right off the bat, we already have a crime, and also, and that's kind of related to the burglary statute somewhat, but also you have him as well impersonating a police officer, which is also a crime. So right off the bat, we have an issue here. But also one thing to analyze too is even if he was a real police officer and he was at the home, could he legally come into the home? And that's something I don't talk a whole lot about in my Fourth Amendment podcast. But there are a lot of exceptions to the Fourth Amendment and the need to have a warrant to search or enter someone's home. And one of the exceptions is consent. So if a police officer knocks on the door and asks if he can come in and search the home, and the homeowner gives consent, then that could be an exception to the warrant. There hasn't necessarily been consent here per se. There's been consent for him to come in. I don't think we see who actually opens the door. I think he's just standing there at the beginning of the movie. So it's an unknown there. And then you have Mr. Mcallister, who goes up to the police officer and asks, hey, am I under arrest or anything? And the police officer says, no, we're just here for precautions, make sure everyone's got safety measures on their home. And then Mr. Mcallister goes off and tells all the safety precautions that he has, which is a tip to this guy who's actually a burglar. And so at that point, I mean, the the purpose of the police officer is pretty much done, but yet he still continues to linger around in the movie. And I mean, and also if Mr. McAllister, if the police officer says he's not under arrest or anything, it's hard because we're social beings, and this police officer is a human too. And so it's hard to be rude and kick people out of their house, but he had a right at that point. If he says, I'm not under arrest, then he can say, please leave my home if you wanted to. But obviously, he's busy and got a lot of things going on. He's a pretty chill guy. So he lets the police officer stay there. But he could have kicked him out at that point. And also, given that the conversation kind of ended and the police officer continued to be there, that could be a Fourth Amendment violation too if his purpose had already ran up, but he's still lingering longer. But also for a Fourth Amendment violation, there has to be some kind of issue, like if the police officer seized evidence or arrested somebody, then that's when a possible civil rights claim could kick in. So there's not necessarily a civil rights claim that could kick in here at this point, even though if he was a real police officer. And so now we'll move on to next part of the movie where you have three kids looking out the window and they see Mr. Marley shoveling the sidewalk, and then they give the story about the shovel slayer and say that he killed his entire family and everyone on the block. They didn't have enough evidence to convict him. So, I mean, that's your typical, I mean, if that's false, then that is a typical defamation / slander situation. And that kind of shows too the importance of defamation and slander law, because you can see when you watch the movie how that perception, how you perceive him, and also how Kevin perceives him and how he acts around you. And so that's definitely, it's not tangible per se, but it definitely is a damage. And I mean, it's even worse if it relates to someone and their occupation or their job, and they lose their job because of it, because then the damages get even more serious. Very important case in point as far as defamation of character. But with this one, if Marley sued the kids, could he recover from the kids if he found out they are saying false things about him? You just have to prove, I mean, some states you have to prove an actual monetary loss, like an actual job loss. Some states you don't have to prove, you just have to prove the value of how much, what your character is worth, and it being lowered in the community. But yeah, side note too, growing up as a kid, in my neighborhood, there was a guy who, he had a home and he completely just did not upkeep the home, and he would show up every once in a while on a bike. He never had a car. And I guess I heard through the grapevine that he worked in the university and pretty much lived at the university. I don't know why he had this home, but he never picked up any of the free newspapers that got thrown on the porch. His backyard was just a complete jungle. So I guess I can empathize with these kids. I kind of had this weird character on my block too, and maybe a lot of you too had the same kind of guys on your block. And everyone would ask us about him and his whereabouts and everything, and we didn't know a whole lot. And apparently the inside of his home was really unkept too, and a mess. Anyways, but also with Mr. Marley, I guess the irony of it is he's called the shovel slayer. And at the very end of the movie, and this is a spoiler if you haven't seen Home Alone yet, but he knocks out both of the burglars with his shovel. So it's funny just how he lives true to his name at the end of the movie. And then the big question is, is that from practice and was actually true. But the other thing showing it wasn't true is they claimed again that he killed his family. But then we find out, and this is kind of what shocks Kevin when he's in the church, that he has a granddaughter, he has a son. So obviously it couldn't be true. So I'm leaning towards probably not true, Mr. Marley. But I guess it's kind of a tidbit that keeps people thinking and wondering, like, really, what's the background behind this guy? The other part I would go to after that is, I mean, it's not necessarily a legal issue per se, but it's just more of an advocacy / resolution standpoint, which attorneys still do. They're still advocates for people, and they still try and resolve issues, hopefully amicably. So we have the big fiasco in the kitchen with the pizza, with the milk spilling, with Kevin pushing on his brother, him not getting cheese pizza. And then you have Uncle Frank, who is the brother of Mr. Mcallister. And he says, "Look what you did, you little jerk." And I mean, if I was Mr. Mcallister, I would have advocated for my son, and I would have told Frank to step down and not let another adult, especially with character Uncle Frank, push my kid around. So I'm pretty surprised that nobody stepped up for Kevin when you had an adult really getting down his throat. I don't think that was very fair for Kevin. But again, this was the 90s, and maybe that's how it worked back in the day. But yeah, so I think bad on Mr. Mcallister. I think that's on Mr. Mcallister. It's his brother. I don't think that's on the wife. I think Mr. Mcallister needed to step in and say, "Hey, back down, Frank." But who knows? Maybe Frank has a temper. He's a hothead. Maybe that would have set Frank off, and maybe worse things would have happened. And also, I mean, it's part of the story too. Obviously, I mean, they have to have a reason on why Kevin is forgotten, and it's part of the reason why he's up in the attic, and also people aren't really thinking too highly at the time of him to remember him in the fiasco when they have to get to the airport. So then now we get to the point where Kevin is forgotten. And there's a big power storm that happens. The power goes out, and Kevin is, and everyone is unable to get up on time because the power goes out. And also a little tidbit too that's important is the power guy, when everyone's trying to leave, says, "Hey, the phones are out, and we're not going to be able to fix the phones for a week." And that's actually a very important part to the movie, is the phones being out. But let's talk a little bit about child neglect laws, and as it pertains to Illinois as well. I'm online just reading websites, and this is important to know too, because sometimes there's a lot of websites that summarize the law. And what I was reading is they're saying that there's statutes in Illinois as it relates to children 14 and under. But what I found in my research was it just said 18 and under. And maybe they changed the law since then. But also it's important to not just look online and search online and in finding the law too, because the laws can change or it may not be interpreted properly. There's a lot of websites that try and give a summary breakdown of all 50 states and what laws pertain to stuff like child neglect laws, and those can go out of date really quickly, or they could not interpret the statute that well. So, but what child neglect law is under Illinois law is it says that a parent or other person responsible for the minor without supervision for an unreasonable period of time without regard for the mental or physical health, safety, or welfare of that minor. And so, yeah, if you leave a minor without supervision for an unreasonable amount of time, and there's a lot of factors that Illinois goes through: special needs, duration of time, age. I mean, age, obviously he's younger, so that's a hit on the parents. Condition and location of place. that can be actually a positive to the parents with how cushy the house is. And then whether the minor was given a phone number to call, he wasn't. And again, that plays in the story. People may think, well, why couldn't he call France? Couldn't he have found some number somewhere to France? And the phones were out at some point, but there is another point where he is able to call eventually. And then whether or not there was food or other provisions left, that's kind of tricky too. I mean, he has to get his brother's life savings in order to feed his face. So obviously there's no money that the parents are leaving around that he's able to access. So that's kind of an issue too for the parents. And Illinois is a stronger law than other states. Some states require it to be an intentional act, but this is just negligence. So, and then like, for example, Alaska, it has to be a gross deviation from standard of conduct that creates a substantial risk. But also, a lot of them are, so that's a risk of bodily injury. So the question is, did this create a substantial risk of bodily injury for leaving Kevin at home for maybe 3 days, 4 days? That's a good question. And most people would probably say, yeah, home alone 4 days without money per se creates a substantial risk of bodily injury. So the parents probably on the hook for child neglect. There was something that just came up in the news recently of a lady who had a 10-year-old, and the 10-year-old, I think it was a very, very small town, and the 10-year-old went out and wandered maybe a half mile away. He was out in the woods, and I think somebody found him, called the police, and then the parent was charged with child neglect. And I think that's probably a pretty extreme charge. And I can't remember what state that was out of, but in Illinois at least, they have exceptions where if a child is traveling to school activities, or if they're at home, or they're traveling to recreational activities by themselves, that's not considered child neglect. And I mean, if they're out playing too, I think in that scenario I just mentioned, that probably wouldn't be a child neglect. And there's some states that have age requirements where you can't leave kids home alone. Most states now, though, I think just because a lot of people, both parents work a lot of homes have both parents working. And so I think a lot of those laws have laxed a little bit, where there's not necessarily a specific requirement on leaving kids home alone. But one problem about these statutes I'm looking at is some statutes can be so vague where you don't know whether or not you're going to commit a crime, where it's kind of the fill in the blanks scenario instead of specifically telling you that in this scenario you're committing a crime. And just reading through a lot of different state statutes, it seems like there's some issues with a lot of states on these child neglect laws and them being maybe unconstitutionally vague, where if you read the statute, you just don't know if you're violating the law or not. Like, for example, here, like in the Illinois one, an unreasonable period of time. What does that mean? That might be a little too vague. And there's some states that are even more vague where, it just creates, where you leave them for so long that it just creates this risk, or and it's just kind of, and a lot of them where it's just like a case by case basis, and so a parent reading the statute may say, okay, well, this may be okay, but then in another scenario, oh no, it could be illegal. So that's an issue where if a statute can make some conduct legal but other conduct illegal, and there's no clear line on what it is, that could be an unconstitutionally vague statute as well. So yeah, just going through child neglect statutes, I think I see some vagueness issues. And then also just real fast as it relates to leaving kids in cars too. That's also a big issue because you always see in the news some kids that are left in the car and then they die of heat stroke. A lot of states have laws where you can't leave a child in a car from ages about 0 to 8. A lot of states have stuff that says heat stroke, if there's a risk of heat stroke, dehydration, hypothermia. So what that would mean is if it's a really hot day or a really, really cold day and you leave a child in the car, you can be on the hook. Tennessee has one of the more strict laws where it just says you can't leave a child in a car this specific age at all, no matter what the weather is. So heads up on that, child neglect. So just looking at this as a whole, I mean, under Illinois law, the parents could be found liable for leaving Kevin at home for 3 or 4 days. And yeah, that could be considered an unreasonable period of time, especially, and then the issues with him not being able to access any money. And the mom admits when she comes home that they don't have any milk. And so Kevin had to go and get milk. So there wasn't a lot of food for 4 days either. And then he was left completely alone. He wasn't left in the supervision of another person. And that's part of the other part of the movie too. The fact that the phones are out and all the neighbors are away too. They can't get a hold of any neighbor to go and see if Kevin's okay. And also just on child neglect too, there's other areas of child neglect that some states have as well. Like there can be medical neglect, emotional neglect, psychological neglect, educational neglect, physical neglect. So if you're not, if your kid's skipping out of school, you're not forcing them to go to school, or if they're not enrolled in school, or if they're not enrolled in school and you're not homeschooling them, that could be considered educational neglect, medical neglect. Obviously, if there's a medical condition and you don't treat that condition, that could be an issue. Physical neglect, if somewhat related to medical neglect, if you're just not taking care of the physical aspects of the child, and that could be like washing clothes too, making sure they're properly bathed. And then emotional, psychological neglect. So, the big question is with how Kevin was treated in that pizza scenario, and Mr. Mcallister just let Frank hammer into them. Does that run into emotional, psychological neglect? But I mean, probably a one case scenario might not be sufficient to make a finding. There probably needs to be like a habitual issue here that's ongoing. But we don't know what it's like for Kevin to be at home and how his parents treat him day to day all the time. So we'll move on from the child neglect stuff, and we'll just quickly touch on Uncle Frank in the airplane talking to his wife, saying, looking at the cups, saying these are real crystal, and telling his wife to put them in her purse. Well, that's obviously a theft issue, the intent to permanently deprive a business or a person of their things or belongings. So you have Uncle Frank committing theft in first class. So that's pretty funny. Then we move on to another theft scenario. Again, intent to permanently deprive. So you have Kevin, and he goes to the store. He wants to buy a toothbrush. He wants to know if his toothbrush is approved by the American Dental Association. And the older lady doesn't know. And then Mr. Marley shows up. And that's a funny scenario because, I mean, if Mr. Marley knows that rumors are swirling around him, I mean, the way he approached Kevin wasn't doing him any good with the bloody hand and hand bandage and slapping it on the table and just staring at Kevin. So because of this, Kevin's scared of this guy. He thinks he's a murderer, and he starts slowly walking away. And so he runs out. So the question is, he forgot he had the toothbrush in his hand, but, or did he? That's the question. And so did he have the intent to permanently deprive Mr. Marley, or I'm sorry, the store? And so that's what the back and forth would be. And Kevin's defense would be, no, I was scared of this guy. I forgot I had the toothbrush in my hand when I ran away. But I guess technically he could have come back and brought the toothbrush back, and he never did. And there's the scene where he looks at his hand and he says, I'm a criminal. So maybe at that point you could claim that he committed theft. And the other issue too is while he's running away, Jimmy, the grocer, tells the police officer to stop him. And so this police officer, and I've talked about this in my Fourth Amendment podcast too, if somebody gives you a tip that a crime has committed and there's an ongoing crime, so Kevin is running away with the toothbrush, police officer has a right to stop you. Because he has probable cause that you've committed a crime. He doesn't need a warrant to stop you. So Kevin knows this, and he sees the police officer and he runs away from him. So that could technically be a crime, fleeing a police officer when it's telling him to stop. And then the other funny thing too is looking at the movie and reading the subtitles. What's funny is the dialogue between the older lady and Herb, who she asks about the toothbrush. At the very beginning, he says, I don't know. But then there's kind of just a quick dialogue between the two. And you can see in the subtitles that he says, just tell him that it's approved. So that could be a crime too. If it's really not approved by the American Dental Association, and he's making a false statement to Kevin to induce him to buy this toothbrush, that could be considered fraud or misrepresentation. That could be a crime / a civil case, because Kevin could sue him and say, hey, wait, this toothbrush isn't approved by the American Dental Association. So, I mean, and the damages would just be the difference between a toothbrush approved by the American Dental Association is not. And I don't know what the price difference between that would be, and or if there's some circumstance where for whatever reason his dentist tells him to have an ADA approved, or somehow it affects his teeth and his teeth go bad because of it. But I don't think that would come into play in this scenario. But yeah, so that's just a funny little tidbit there about what they told him. So then the other thing is, and again, this is part of the script and has to be like this, but obviously there's probably a huge PR issue that Chicago and the suburban area had to deal with the police officers when the mother calls the police and how they respond. And yeah, I mean, this doesn't sound like it's a real world scenario, and it's just the way the movie has to play out. But it is crazy that the lady just doesn't take it seriously. And then she transfers to someone and he doesn't take it seriously. But I mean, they do eventually send an officer to go to the home. But again, there's still like a lack of concern going on here. And so it should be a big issue. And all states have some kind of child protective services, DCFS, welfare, social workers, and usually they send social workers to go to the home and check on the children. And that probably would have been the best case, what should have happened, instead of just having this police officer. And the whole reason why you have these welfare DCFS people is they can be more approachable than a police officer just going. And then you have the police officer who knocks on the door, nobody answers, and he goes on his thing and he says, tell the parents to count their kids again. And again, yeah, I mean, the child may not answer the door, and there could be consent there, or they may need to get a warrant and go in and double check to make sure there's no child alone in the home with their parents in France. But then the question is, once the police officers find that, what do they do? Where do they put the kid? They put him in the police. They just take him to the police precinct. And yeah, that's a good question. I don't do a lot of child welfare stuff. I mean, usually there's foster care scenarios, or maybe they would try and reach out to relatives, grandparents. Maybe Mrs. Mcallister had family nearby. Seems unlikely though, because obviously she would have reached out to them, or neighbors to help take care of this kid for a couple days. So that's probably what should have happened. So yeah, bad on the police, obviously, and their response, and probably in a real world situation that wouldn't happen, especially if you're getting a phone call from the parents themselves who are essentially admitting to child neglect. Yeah, I mean, could there be a potential claim against the police officers? Maybe, but again, I haven't done a whole lot of those cases, and police officers have a lot of immunity. And just the fact that the police officer knocked on the door, maybe that would be enough, but maybe not if they really should have got a search warrant, gone into the home and really searched the area to make sure there wasn't a kid there. So that's that scenario, the police officers. But again, it had to be part of the movie because Kevin had to fight off these burglars by himself. So that's what the movie was setting it up for, and ruling out all other options. Because if this scenario wouldn't have happened, then yeah, in the back of the mind, a lot of people could have been like, well, why didn't he just call the police, or why couldn't the police just step in? And that's so dumb. And I think they really hammer that part of the story down too, because there are things too where why doesn't Kevin call the police? And at the very beginning of the movie, again, you have Harry impersonating a police officer, and Kevin sees him, and Kevin sees the gold flash in his tooth. And then later on, when he gets almost hit by the van, and obviously he's not a police officer, and he just, looks like a bum or a plumber or whatever, and he sees the same flash. So I think Kevin in his mind is like, wait a minute, what's going on? He's a police officer now, but he's this then, what's going on with the system? So I think that's to rule out all things too, where Kevin is afraid of the system. He's afraid that, if he called the police, he would, Harry would just show up. And the other part too probably is the fact that he ran away from the police officer. That may be part of it too, and just showing how he doesn't trust the police. And also the fact that the police may be after him. He may be arrested for stealing a toothbrush. So yeah, I think they try and cover that hole in the story as well as they can in that kind of scenario. Then we get to another just quick part. You have the mother riding in a rental van with a bunch of guys. Nobody has a seatbelt. That's the legal issue. I think seatbelt laws were in play either in Pennsylvania or Ohio at that time, or Illinois. Then we get to another funny kind of scenario where with the pizza guy, where Kevin uses the movie to have a dialogue with the pizza guy, and he just tells him to leave it on the porch. And that's where Kevin should have left it, but instead he thinks he'll have fun with him. And obviously it's a funny part of the movie where in the movie the guy murders the other guy and threatens him. So that's a funny part. And but also, I mean, this pizza guy got threatened with murder, essentially, he thinks, and that gunshots were shot at him. So, I mean, that's a potential legal issue. I mean, the pizza guy could have called the police, and the police could have come and investigated that scenario. And because pizza guy was in fear for his life. And then the question is, did Kevin commit a crime in that scenario? And I mean, he probably wouldn't be convicted per se because he's just playing a movie. Obviously, he knew what he was doing, and that it wasn't just the movie was playing and the pizza guy heard it. He intentionally did it that way. But Kevin obviously didn't have an actual intent to commit any crime. So that could be probably wouldn't be found liable for that, but there could be some other types of crimes like criminal mischief or something, where that threat could actually find a traction and get a conviction. And so then that brings us to the climax of the movie. So again, if you haven't seen it, this is spoiler, so I wouldn't go any further if you haven't seen it and want to see it before hearing all these spoilers. So you have Kevin. He finds out that these people are going to burglarize his home. So what does Kevin do? He gets ready for them, and he sets up all these traps, these booby traps. And so in some states, and again, all 50 states have different laws as it relates to this, but as to self-defense of your home. So some states have like retreat laws where if you can safely retreat from your home without having to inflict bodily injury on another person, including if it's a burglar, you have to retreat. And then at the point where you can't retreat, then you can use force, including deadly force. There are some states that have more like a castle law where it's my house, I have to defend it, like what Kevin says, where you don't have to retreat. And if someone's committing a crime or attempting to commit bodily harm on you, then you can defend yourself. And so Illinois has that law where you can defend yourself. But also, as far as self-defense, when it comes to self-defense, it has to be a reasonable use of force. And so the question is, what is reasonable and what may go beyond reasonableness? And so we have all these booby traps. You have icy steps. I mean, if I was Kevin's lawyer, I just obviously you usually don't want your client to testify, and so you don't want anyone to know that Kevin was the one that made the steps icy, and so it may be hard to prove if Kevin's not going to talk if he's the one that made the steps icy. So it could just be assumed that the steps were just icy by themselves, and I think that could be reasonable to assume. But then you get into the tarred stairs, and then you have a nail on the tarred stairs. And is that reasonable? And it's a good question. You have the falling iron. Is the falling iron reasonable? And then you have a flamethrower. The flamethrower could be beyond reasonableness. That might be a little too much. But I think too, when it comes to, so I think part of the thing with booby traps is, you could be setting booby traps for bad guys, but part of the issue is, what if you get the mailman? What if you get the Amazon guy? And so if you try and claim self-defense and you get the mailman, Amazon guy, that wouldn't be reasonable. But the thing is here with Kevin is he knew that they were coming at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock. And so he knew they were specifically coming at a time, and he was preparing right before they came. And so that could be a little bit more on the reasonableness side. And then also, I mean, most people would probably say that a gun would be reasonable, but these booby traps wouldn't be reasonable. But if you look at it, the fact that Kevin's a kid and he may not have access to his dad's gun or dad may not have a gun, then I mean, what's his other options? All he has is a BB gun, and so be, given the age of Kevin and the circumstances, you could claim that yes, based from the mind of an 8-year-old kid, all of these could be reasonable. I mean, these guys are, you know, adults. He's an 8-year-old, and so if adult did these things, then you'd probably say, yeah, these are unreasonable. But if it's an 8-year-old, I'd probably say that could be to say that this is more in the realm of reasonable. And also, I mean, and so what issue are we looking at here? We're looking at if these guys brought claims against Kevin, and if criminal charges were brought against Kevin for the bodily injury he did to these burglars. And as we all know the movie, I mean, from how we know Kevin and his circumstance and how we know these two guys and their characters, I don't think a jury would ever convict Kevin at all in this scenario. I mean, it could be a closer call maybe if Kevin was a little bit older, maybe if he was 15 years old, and maybe if he had kind of this mentality in general towards other people and wasn't your normal, ordinary citizen. And maybe if these burglars weren't as crazy about getting Kevin and getting into this home, and maybe if it was more of a watered down scenario, then it could go more towards the burglars. And yeah, I mean one question too is if this just popped up in the news and how would the news portray Kevin? Would they portray Kevin as a hero, or would they portray Kevin as this crazy, wild juvenile, like setting these traps for people, and not getting the full story like we know from watching the movie? So a lot of it is portrayal, and so that would be important on trying to tell the jury who Kevin is, what kind of character he has, and kind of demonizing these other guys and what they were trying to do. So all of these, and some of these things are like the fan and the saran wrap. Obviously, I don't think he could be charged for crime with that one. The ornaments, I think, is kind of like the icy steps too. You want Kevin to say that he intentionally put the ornaments there, and that just could have been like, well, you came through the window and there were ornaments, and more accidental. But then you have the hot door handles and the swinging paint cans, and again the flamethrower. And so yeah, those are some issues that go into the unreasonable standard. But the other thing too is Kevin just wasn't trying. At some point, Kevin wasn't just trying to protect his house from burglars. He was trying to protect himself. And I think there's argument too that at the beginning too, he wasn't just trying to protect himself, but I guess it could be argued as well where, he could have just not been at the house. He could have stayed at the church and just let them rifle through his house and then move on. So that could have been a scenario for Kevin as well. Instead, he decides to defend his house. But I mean, at some point, they're mad at him and they're going after him specifically. They don't really care about burglarizing, robbing the house. They care more about getting Kevin and inflicting bodily injury on him. So I would say that when you get to the micro machines and the paint cans, that's more self-defense of him against them and not just defending the house. And so I would say the paint cans and the micro machines are probably reasonable, and then the trippy wire, probably reasonable. And then him going across into the treehouse and then cutting the rope, I would say, they're again threatening bodily injury on him when they get to him. And so cutting the rope is probably reasonable for him to cut the rope, and he'd be okay with self-defense instead of a claim against him for assault. So now we get to the point in the movie where Kevin he actually calls the police officers. But what's funny too is he doesn't call the police to come to his house. And again, I don't know if that's if he's concerned about him getting in trouble or his parents getting in trouble or not wanting to cause a scene at his house or whatever. I don't know. But he calls and wants them to go to Murphy's house instead and wants to lure them to Murphy's house. And so he goes down into the basement, and I don't know why he goes into the house. Maybe because he's trying to lure them in there, and I don't know why he goes up the stairs. And he thinks that they're gonna follow them through the water and up, and maybe he thinks they'll have to go through the water and up, and then the police come and he can just run home, and that's the end of it. Because then they're caught red-handed because obviously they've hit that house already. But they go the other way through the house and they catch Kevin when he opens the door at the top of the steps. And so that gets us to kidnapping. So, kidnapping, a lot of people don't understand how kidnapping works. And I've just went through the kidnapping statute. And it's a lot easier to commit a crime of kidnapping than people think. I think a lot of people think that you have to actually grab somebody and take them a mile away and tie them up. But that's not necessarily true. And under the statute, just picking up someone and moving them could be considered kidnapping. And kidnapping doesn't mean you're necessarily snatching a kid. It can apply to adults as well. And so what kidnapping is at least under the Illinois statute, is secretly confines another against his or her will by force, carries another from one place to another with intent to confine that other person against his or her will. So if you pick someone up, put them in a car, that could be kidnapping. And even if the car doesn't move, if the doors are locked or whatever and they're confined, that could be kidnapping. Just that one move, picking them up, putting them in. And that is obviously force, using that force to move them. And so you have it where they pick Kevin up and they put him on the nail hook hanger thing, and then they start making threats on him. So just the act of picking Kevin up and putting him on the door, and then obviously he's confined in this house as well against his will, that's kidnapping. So they've also committed kidnapping as well. And also the Illinois statute says that if your parents don't consent to the confinement, then and they're under 13 years of age, then that's class 2 felony. So did Kevin's parents consent to having him on that hanger in the house against his will? Probably not, but again, how they treated him at the beginning, maybe they didn't care. No, I'm sure they would have cared on that scenario. So yeah, they've committed kidnapping then. So that's class 2 felony. And then you have the threats against Kevin they essentially threaten him with all the same things that Kevin did to him. And also, I mean, Kevin is a smaller, more fragile human than these adults. And so same type of stuff that they were subject to could inflict more harm, especially the flamethrower on the head. And in reality, yeah, he wouldn't have just gotten away with what he did with that flamethrower on his head for how long he sat there. But if they did that to Kevin, I mean, yeah, he could have suffered some severe burns just with that flamethrower alone, and or potentially death. And then also he threatened, and then he's about to bite off all of his fingers. And so here we have, and obviously it doesn't happen because Marley steps in, but that is aggravated assault and or potentially could be murder, if because some murder statutes have it where you don't, it's not just you have the intent to kill, but you have the intent to commit bodily injury that has a high likelihood of resulting in death. But that could potentially be a lower murder, so it may not be first degree murder, it could be a second degree murder. And maybe he has a defense because he was, but I don't think he has a defense. But I mean, some may say that Harry has a defense because of everything that Kevin did to him. He's acting in the heat of passion, so that would bring it down to a lower kind of murder. But I don't think that's. I think he could still technically be charged for first degree, but definitely somewhere in the second degree murder area. And again, and not just murder, but also aggravated assault with the threats of biting off his fingers. That's causing serious bodily injury to someone. I think would definitely fall up in the aggravated assault realm. And then at the very end, you have old man Marley, and he steps in, and like I said at the beginning, he lives up to his name of being the shovel slayer, and hits both guys on the head. And so could old man Marley be charged with a crime? And I would say definitely not in that scenario. No way he could be charged with a crime. He was acting in self-defense of another person, and no way he could be convicted in my mind. Even if the state charged him with aggravated assault, the jury should let him off in that scenario. With Kevin hanging on, and how we all know Kevin, and how everyone got into that scenario. So so where are all the crimes that these guys can be charged with for their actions? So I mean, it seems, I mean, obviously they hit Murphy's house, who he calls, and I don't know if in the movie when they are in a house and they're talking, if that's the same house or another house. But they hit at least another house. Maybe, I mean, I would say that, I mean, they probably hit 5 houses before they go towards this house. And so I would say that's 5 charges of burglary, which is entering of a home with the intent to, I guess under Illinois law, it's to commit a felony. And felonies can be, I mean, theft can be a type of felony depending on how much stuff you steal. And so if you've stolen, usually if it's more than like $1,000 or something, that runs more into the felony zone instead of the theft zone. And so I'm sure they left more than $1,000, and also damages. They've committed damage with the flooding of the homes, and that committed damage as well to the homes in the thousands of dollars, and that could be considered that's definitely a crime, vandalism, and so there's definitely at least in my mind 5 counts of burglary here. And then, as we already talked about, you had the attempted aggravated assault, and then we also had the other burglary charge for falsely representing to be a police officer. Then we also have impersonating a police officer. I mean, you may have to pick and choose if you're the prosecutor on what crime you want to go for, because those could be the same crime, and could be a double jeopardy issue. Yeah, so in Illinois, that is 4 to 5 years in prison with $25,000 fine for each charge, and it could be more. And two, depending on the circumstances, they could bump that up. Those are class 1 felonies, the burglary ones, and they could be bumped up to a little bit higher amount of years too. And then the question is, will all the charges run consecutively? If they're charged with 5 crimes and they're 4 to 5 years, will it just be 4 to 5 years consecutively, or do they have to serve 5 years, 5 years, 5 years, 5 years? So that's one thing that the judge would have to figure out. And if that's the case, then I mean, just on the first degree felonies alone, they should be facing at least 12 years in prison. And I think a judge would also consider the aggravating factors as well, that there was a minor involved, and they were putting this minor in at risk as well. It wasn't just, property issues, and then the amount of times that it was done, and then just the sheer planning and calculation. It just wasn't something done on a whim per se. It was a planned operation done for quite a while. So, I mean, if I was the judge, and again, we all know the circumstances of the movie, I'd throw the book at these guys and not give them some kind of deal. If I was the prosecutor too, I mean, the evidence seems pretty easy for them to prove with wet bandits and them. I mean, yeah, the big mistake they made was leaving the water running. And so because of leaving that kind of mark, it's easier for the police to prove that this is what they did and that it couldn't have been anyone else for these burglaries. And especially if there's a fingerprint issue and or DNA issue and they can't find any evidence to trace them to some of the burglaries. So that was a big mistake on their part in leaving the water running. But they could definitely be charged with a crime for burglary in the Murphy house. Even if they couldn't tie them to the water running, they broke and entered into the home and then committed a felony when they wanted to inflict bodily harm on Kevin. And then also in the home of Kevin, when they entered the home and wanted to inflict bodily harm on Kevin, and even though they didn't steal anything, still say that they committed a felony in there with wanting to assault Kevin. So if they hadn't stolen anything, but also if they had the intent to commit a crime, they could still be charged with felony. And also, you can, if somebody gets hurt in committing a felony, and I talk about this in my criminal law podcast, like if for whatever reason Kevin died, and even if it wasn't per se their fault, like it was just like, say Kevin was trying to run away and he was on the hanger thing and somehow something unfortunate happened and Kevin gets hurt really bad, or unfortunately Kevin falls and dies because the zip line isn't working, or any other scenario where it's not necessarily the fault of them directly, they're not actually doing anything to cause it, they could still be charged for first degree murder, because if you commit it's called felony murder if you commit a felony and then in committing the felony somebody dies or gets injured, you can be on the hook for first degree murder if somebody dies while you're committing the felony, even if it's not necessarily you. Like if you burglarize a home and you start running away and the guy's running after you and he slips on the ice and he dies, that could be a first degree murder because it's felony murder rule and you could be charged first degree murder. So luckily nothing happened to Kevin, but they could still be charged for attempted murder and or felony murder. And then also they're conspirators to crimes, conspiring to commit crimes. And maybe they could, if they found a list of other homes they're going to hit, they could charge them as well. Like if there's a list of 100 homes they're going to hit, they could charge them with 100 of 100 crimes potentially of attempting to burglarize those homes. I mean, obviously, a defense attorney would say, were they really going to burglarize all those homes? So, yeah, that's it. The last thing I would say is, this is definitely a 90s movie, and 90s movies are definitely a little more quirky, spunky, a little less realism to them, and the bad guys are always over the top. But yeah, I mean, in my mind, the whole funny thing is, I mean, they see the party going on, the fake party that Kevin puts on. And so, I mean, at that point, I would have just said, we're not doing this. Oh, it's just funny how these 90 villains push so hard to get that house. But I think in reality, I don't think anyone would go after that house after seeing that party going on that Kevin has. And also the fact that just Kevin's there. Even if they know Kevin's alone, that's something I wouldn't touch unless, again, they're these depraved villains that have no, there's no moral conscience or thought of any repercussions of what they do. The other big thing, though, too, is when the big one where they should have definitely just backed away and just said no is when Kevin puts on the video for them of the movie of the murder, and then Marv thinks that somebody just got shot in the house, blown away, kind of, somebody committing a crime too. And at that point, if somebody got blown away in that house by someone else, and they hear the argument, they hear the gunshots, and they think that something happened, again, why are they pushing to take that house so bad? Why do they want it so bad? So, again, 90s should have been no reason for them to continue to push on that, but it is what it is, and still, it's a great movie, wonderful movie. John Williams, wonderful music, wonderful script, and they do as good as they can closing all the holes legally to make it look real, and make it look like these parents weren't trying to be mean on Kevin. It was just kind of a heat of a moment. They have a big family. They have to get to the airport. They have 45 minutes to get to the airport. I think the funny thing is with the airport is, yeah, they have 45 minutes to get to the airport. And then nowadays, there's no way you could get to the airport on time in 45 minutes, unless maybe they live 15 minutes away from the airport. But the airport has changed a lot since 9/11. In the 90s, security wasn't as bad, and they didn't look through every crevice of your body. And then also, so the one question that a lot of people might have as it relates to the Fourth Amendment and airport searches is, where are my Fourth Amendment rights with these? And that's one question I had in law school too. And what I found out was, I guess they claim that if you want to step on an airplane, then you are essentially consenting to waiving your Fourth Amendment rights. That's how it works. I don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, in all other cases, when it comes to waiving your rights, you have to sign it away, like with a judge. Like if you're waiving your right to a jury trial, if you're waiving your right to an attorney, like there has to be a paper you sign saying that it was made knowingly and intelligently, that you were under the influence of alcohol, stuff like that, or if you're pleading guilty. And so, I mean, I'd say that Fourth Amendment right is just as important as airplanes in scenario, and there shouldn't be a watered down scenario and just saying, just passing a law saying that you're consenting to it, you're agreeing to this. I mean, I would at least want something, when you buy the ticket or you go through TSA, you at least click something saying, yes, I consent. I would feel more comfortable with that instead of just saying it's implied. And the same thing is when you cross the border as well into the United States. Um, it's yeah, there was a time where me and my wife, we went over the border from San Diego into Mexico, and there was a huge long line to get back into the United States border, and I saw another line that was a little bit shorter, and apparently it was, one of those fast lines where you have some kind of card and you can go through the line faster, and I didn't know that. So we get there and we didn't have it. And so they subjected our car to like an entire X-ray search, and so at that point I was thinking, okay, well, what are my rights there too? And I guess the border is the same as you're consenting to search when you're coming back into the country. But again, I don't fully agree with that, and I think they still needed to some kind of probable cause to X-ray my car before going back into the country, because and just a mistake on my mind in getting in the long line. I don't think there was probable cause for them to do an additional search than they would other cars just because I got in the wrong line. So yeah, but so those are issues I have with the Fourth Amendment. I think it's a very important part, and I've heard too of laws where, like I think I heard where people who own a falcon in California, they have to consent to a search at any time by police officers if they own a falcon, and I think kind of similar state laws as well to ownership of certain things in areas. And I mean, on the one hand, you can look at the state and say, okay, yeah, there's some scenarios where you need to check on people depending on what they have. But I mean, I think a falcon is pushing it. I mean, I think the only state interest is just making sure that, falcon isn't ripping people to shreds, just protection of people, and not, ripping and tearing apart children, especially. But I still don't think that that's enough to say that, hey, yeah, based off this, you get a falcon, you waive your Fourth Amendment rights. And yeah, so I'm not a fan of those laws. Not a fan of the airport thing, but also, I mean, and it's in principle what I'm talking about. I mean, the airport scenario is, if it was different where they had to have probable cause to search you, then I guess, just being on an airplane, it could be more dangerous if more people are bringing guns, and it's kind of an implied right to bring guns in, or, maybe it's illegal still to bring guns in, but you don't have, but you can't do an entire search to stop guns from coming in, and if a bullet goes off, that can affect the plane and everything. So, I mean, there are reasons as to that. I mean, I would feel better if it wasn't the government. So the Fourth Amendment, again, only applies to government intervention on your rights. So if these airline companies did these searches independently, and Delta was searching me and not the government, I would feel more comfortable with that. And also that, the government wasn't telling them to do it, and there could be evidence to say here. So I would feel more comfortable with a private company doing it, because then not necessarily my Fourth Amendment rights are being violated and claiming that I've consented to search, but it's a private company, so Fourth Amendment doesn't apply. So in a perfect world, that's probably what I would do to try and fix the airline situation, but also make sure safety's involved, so that we're protecting the principle of the Fourth Amendment, but then also protecting people too at the same time. Anyways, this is Brian Jackson signing off. Hope you guys enjoyed my podcast. Like and subscribe for more Law Up podcasts, and we'll do a lot more of these, analyzing law and fun scenarios like this. And we'll talk to you next time. Thanks.